morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Daisy Lemus. I'm a professor of communication studies. I'm also the co-PI of a grant in urban forestry that was funded by the USDA. And part of the grant was to bring to CSUN more programming related to urban forestry, sustainability, and just thinking about it in terms of workforce development, but also ways in which the students can prepare in all kinds of ways. So when my friend Amanda said that her book was coming out, it was an amazing opportunity because it combines environmentalism with religious studies, which is unheard of. So we're ahead of the game here, talking about environmental stewardship. So it was very exciting for me to learn and to be able to share with you this book launch, her book titled Falling in Love with Nature, the Values of Latinx Catholic Environmentalism. And so I don't want to say any more about Amanda or our facilitator because I'm going to be giving away their presentation. So I won't do that. But instead, I'd like for us to receive her with a big, big applause.
Thank you, Daisy, and thank you all for being here. I was sharing with Daisy this morning, so this is actually my second book, but the first one, it was my revised dissertation, and I came out here to CSUN, and I worked really hard, and I finished revising that into a book, and I had a couple of children, and then the book came out literally, my younger son was 6 weeks old, and we were going out for a stroller ride, and the book was sitting on the ground at my doorstep. It had been delivered. I was like, oh, I guess we'll take it for a walk with us. And that was my book launch. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you all today at a much bigger setting. And I have friends from the community here in the middle, and I appreciate you all coming, and lots of friends that I've known at CSUN for many years now. So this is really, truly awesome, and I appreciate you all being here and sharing this with me. And I am really happy to be doing this launch at CSUN because this is totally a CSUN book. I would have never ended up writing this book if I landed somewhere else out of grad school. I began formulating the questions for this book in my classes with my students, particularly religion and ecology. And from the very get-go when I got here in 2012, my students let me know that there were some really serious limitations in the frameworks that I brought here from graduate school. And then the research for the book itself did grow out of a class research project where we were conducting focus groups field work within a particular community. And that helped me kind of have the chutzpah to go to a place where I was pretty far out of place with the support of my students and learning that there was a big story to tell. So I'm really thrilled to share this stories with you today. And I'm going to start by sharing a story from my book. Oh, and by the way, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk for hopefully about half an hour. I'm actually going to time it so I don't talk too long. And then we are very, very lucky to have Dr. Steinberg over here, who's the new director of the Institute for Sustainability. Yeah, woohoo, indeed. And she's going to ask some questions. We'll have kind of a dialogue, and then we'll open it up for all of your questions.
So Amanda, just a little housekeeping. There's seats. No one should be standing.
Yeah.
There are plenty of seats up front. Please join us in the front.
All right, so I'm going to start by sharing a story from my book. And by the way, all of the names are pseudonyms. So the people are anonymous who I spoke with, but it's all people from across Los Angeles who are church-going Catholics. Maritza, a 30-something charismatic Catholic and a daughter of Salvadoran immigrants, had embraced a set of environmentally sustainable behaviors, such as conserving energy and water, recycling, and not wasting food, for as long as she could remember. As she told me about these behaviors when we met at her church in 2015, Maritza explained that she was not involved with any specifically environmental ministries or organizations, and she did not consider environmentalism among her top priorities. Yet simple home-based conservation measures were mundane aspects of her daily life. Maritza sometimes prayed to God for relief from the drought that had plagued Southern California in recent years. And she also helped the earth by cultivating cacti and other plants in pots throughout her home. Taking care of plants was important, Maritza maintained, because plants provided oxygen. She was worried about the world's oxygen supply, given scientists' dire warnings about greenhouse gases greenhouse gases, that would be. Greenhouse gases building up in the Earth's atmosphere. And she suggested that planting more trees could be a helpful response. If each person who cuts down a tree would plant 10 more so they can grow, Maritza suggested in Spanish, the planet would have enough oxygen. Maritza's reflections are from a focus group that my students and I conducted at a large, predominantly Latinx parish on the outskirts of Los Angeles in 2015. We were there because we wanted to better understand the results of a survey that had recently been released. So the survey was conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute, which is this big national organization that researches religion in the United States. These are the groups that were statistically significant and were included in the study. It was 2,000 households that they spoke with. So I'm going to let you take a look at the list and just kind of guess in your mind, who do you think might care the most about climate change and who might care the least? All right, you have your answer in your head? So here are the results. You'll see here that Hispanic Catholics are more likely to be concerned than any other group, and interestingly, white Catholics are the least likely to be concerned. And then you'll see we've got Hispanic Catholics and unaffiliated, and then Black Protestants. And so there's this really cool event that all the religious studies professors go to every November. This year it's in San Diego. It's our big conference. There's like 10,000 of us, and we walk around the conference center for a few days. It's really cool. You should all come. So this was released at our meeting in 2014. And at first people were like, oh my God, that is shocking that we had these results. Because they thought maybe unaffiliated or mainline white Protestant or maybe Jews, those are the people that they expected to express the most concern. But it wasn't. It was Hispanic Catholics who expressed the most concern. So then, after a few hours, because we're religious studies professors and we know a lot, people figured it out. They're like, I know why. It's actually not that surprising. It's because of environmental racism, environmental injustice. Hispanic Catholics and Black Protestants care the most because they're the most likely to suffer from environmental harms. That's one possible explanation. Disproportionate suffering is definitely something that's real. And this very survey found that people of color were more likely to think climate change would affect them personally. So yes, definitely, that's part of the story. But going back to that first focus group that I was telling you about, my students and I were there talking to Maritza and her fellow churchgoers that night because we suspected that there was more to the story than just people of color care the most because they're suffering from environmental problems. Based on my previous research and my conversations with CSUN students in my first few years teaching here, I knew that minoritized communities' relationships with the environment could not be reduced to their experiences with environmental suffering. So to be clear, the environmental justice movement is essential. We need to talk about environmental racism. Those are extremely important. What I'm saying, though, is that there has to be more to the story. If we can only think about environmental values among communities of color through a focus on the ways that people are suffering from environmental problems, we fail to recognize the many other ways that diverse communities might relate to the natural world as agents, not just victims. So I promise you, if this survey came out at the AAR meeting and it was white Protestants and Jews who are at the top, the scholars wouldn't have said, oh, it's because of environmental racism, right? They would have said, oh, they have deep traditions that care about the earth. Maritza's example of cultivating plants in order to improve the quality of the air offers a compelling counter-story that undercuts dominant frameworks of victimhood. And Maritza was not the only person in her prayer group that night who described an active set of environmental values. These stories illustrate a striking need for new narratives of American environmentalism. So that's what I tried to do in this book. Falling in love with nature draws from focus groups, interviews, and ethnographic research that my students and I conducted across Los Angeles for several years, starting in 2015. We focused particularly on Spanish-speaking Catholics for two main reasons. First, that survey. That was kind of funny, right? Hispanic Catholics care the most, white Catholics care the least. So we did do research in LA. You can't just go say like, hey, I'm here at your church. I want to talk to the white Catholics, or here I'm, but what we figured out over time is to speak with Spanish-speaking Catholics and English-speaking Catholics. So those were the two communities that we spoke with. The other reason specifically we focused on Catholics was because Pope Francis, the head of the global Catholic Church, issued an encyclical, or this big major teaching document called Laudato Si, and it was the first time a pope has dedicated an entire encyclical to climate change and the environment. So those two things kind of converged at the exact same time. The survey results were released. I was like, oh, interesting, Catholics. And then I found out the Pope was about to be releasing this encyclical. And so climate change and the environment were going to be big for Catholics. So that was why we focused on these particular communities. Basically, we just started showing up at churches, and we didn't just show up. I called the priest, basically, talk to the priest, say, hey, we're doing this research project. My students are, conducting this research. Could we come to your parish? And often, then we would have a meeting with the priest first to tell them about it. Sometimes, for the most part, they said yes. There was a couple cases where they said no. But basically, we would go talk to people, usually people that already gathered. So maybe it would be, a religious education class that meets every Wednesday night. And that group would agree to let us come during their Wednesday night meeting one week so that they could talk to us about their environmental values. At first, I did disclose that I was interested in Catholic environmentalism, but I found out that really kind of narrowed who I was talking to. So like if I told the priest, I want to talk to Catholics about the environment, they would send me to the people most likely to care about the environment, which is going to be the progressive white group in the parish, right? So I changed the methodology so that I just said we're interested in Catholic values in daily life. And then also that way, the research participants wouldn't necessarily, if they know I'm interested in environment, they might want to kind of tell me what I want to hear and play up their values. So we changed that. So that's how we did the research among Spanish-speaking Catholics who don't, participate in environmentalism in an organized way. And then we also did a bunch of research among Catholics responding to Laudato Si. So all of those groups are represented. So throughout this research, the Spanish-speaking Catholics that I met taught me that home-based conservation measures, such as cultivating backyard gardens, avoiding consumerism, and limiting waste, were routinely shared among families in their communities. I describe these practices as La Tierra environmentalism, following feminist theologian Jeanette Rodriguez's work on La Tierra theology. I know there's a ton of Spanish speakers in here. What is La Tierra? The earth. What else? The earth? Soil, land. And then how about mi tierra? What is that kind of? Homeland, right? So trying to let y'all talk for a minute so I could drink. So La Tierra can mean the land, the earth, or one's country. And so for Jeanette Rodriguez, this theologian, La Tierra theology incorporates all three of these meanings: a theology of the land rooted in a sense of relationality with family, the earth, and one's home. It identifies a special relationship to land rooted in the intersection of Catholic theology and Latinx culture. Building on Rodriguez's insights, I define La Tierra environmentalism as an embodied ethic of living lightly on the earth, that is rooted in a sense of love and respect for God, fellow humans, and the rest of God's creation. Its primary locus is in the home, where family members impart practical knowledge and skills rooted in the experiences of everyday life. But its concerns radiate outward and include awareness of human struggles and global ecological issues. While its measures may be grounded in economic necessity, La Tierra environmentalism is sustained through values of moderation and respect, and is reinforced through stories of Latin American ancestors who maintained a sustainable, reciprocal relationship with the land. So my argument in the book is that a focus on La Tierra environmentalism shows that Spanish-speaking Catholics in the United States participate in their own distinct environmental traditions that combine Catholic sensibilities with indigenous wisdom and cultural values grounded in Latin America. Yet these stories have often remained hidden because they don't meet the expectations and assumptions of mainstream white environmentalism. So in the remainder of my talk, I'm going to give you kind of three key aspects of La Tierra environmentalism, kind of what does this look like, and illustrate it with some stories. When I first started this research back in 2015, so I'm going out calling priests, showing up at their doors, talking to them. Frequently, they advised me to adjust my project because they thought Latinx communities would have little to say about the environment. Wow. Yeah, exactly. Several priests encouraged me to visit a predominantly white parish in the wealthy community of Manhattan Beach because that church was involved with Catholic environmental programming. They had speakers on Laudato Si and the environment. So, I mean, literally 3 priests that I went to, they're like, oh, look, I just got this flyer. They're doing a talk on Laudato Si. You should go to Manhattan Beach if you want to hear about Catholics and the environment. One Cuban-American priest told me that in Manhattan Beach, they have the time and luxury of being able to spend time and resources on environmental issues. By contrast, he explained, the members of his working class, primarily Latinx parish were in survival mode. He told me they were overwhelmed with the struggles of daily life, of feeding and clothing their kids. They didn't have time to worry about the origins of global warming. And yet, here are some statements that I heard in my very first focus group conversation, and this was with Spanish-speaking Catholics who are mostly immigrants from Mexico and Central America, a very working class group that was attending a religious education class at one of the parishes in LA. Oh, that was a prettier slide with my argument. All right. From the moment we believe in God and all of his creation, we're already aware of nature and the connections that humans have with nature. From the simple fact of being Catholic and believing in God and the Bible, we are 100% conscious of nature and the environment. Here's another. God created everything, and we have to love it. All creation is made by God, and we must love plants like a brother. Not protecting the environment is the same as looking at a brother in the street and not helping him. So in that very first focus group, I heard statement after statement like this, treating the earth with love and respect, about protecting the limited environmental resources that we've been given, about loving nature as a place to meet God. As my research progressed, I found that that initial conversation was not an outlier. Through my conversations about environmental values among Latinx churchgoers over the following several years, the people I met taught me that the values I'm calling La Tierra environmentalism are widespread. And that's why you laughed right here, because you also know that these values are widespread. So here are 3 main aspects of La Tierra environmentalism, illustrated with stories that my interlocutors shared throughout my research. So the first aspect of La Tierra environmentalism is that it does involve active love for nature and concern for global ecological issues. A lot of times when environmental organizations are trying to engage minority communities, I should say when predominantly white environmental organizations are trying to engage with minority communities, they do so by talking about environmental racism and environmental injustice. La Tierra environmentalism shows that people of color can actively love for nature and care about global environmental issues. It should maybe be obvious. It's probably obvious to many of you in the room, and yet it's not obvious to a lot of environmental organizers. So in my research, Latinx Catholics did talk about traditional environmental justice concerns like human suffering related to the drought. They encouraged food conservation with awareness that many people in their community didn't have enough to eat. But many also mentioned active love for nature and the environment. And they expressed concerns about global ecological issues. This research was early in the Trump era. So they were talking about President Trump's energy policies, the Dakota Access Pipeline, climate change, natural resource depletion, consumerism, and more. Carlos was a 31-year-old electrician who had immigrated to Los Angeles from Mexico as a young child. He specifically mentioned polar bears when he talked to me about the global ecological problems that his generation faced. He said, if you don't care about the planet, it's really going to be messed up. I mean, have you guys seen what's going on with the polar bears? That's sad, dude. Like, they're dying. I don't even know about you guys, but I love animals. Many of my interlocutors expressed a special connection with trees, maybe for the urban forestry project. They indicated that trees, close relationships with trees were a special marker of Latinx identity in the United States. So Carlos, that electrician, he told me this story about taking his friend to his grandma's house. So his grandma was Mexican-American, but she lives in a predominantly white neighborhood. And he shows up, with a couple of friends, and they get to her block and they go, oh, that one's your grandma's house, because she was the only one that had fruit trees all through her yard. Another story, Robert, a second-generation Mexican-American in his 20s, also described an abundance of fruit trees that were always in Latinx neighborhoods. He said, usually you'll have an avocado tree, you'll have an orange tree, an apple tree, a guava tree, some type of a fruit tree, maybe from wherever they're from. They usually grow here pretty well. At that point, a lot of people had been telling me about trees, right? And so I said to Robert, like, what's the deal with trees? How come everybody's telling me about trees? And he said, well, if you're Latino and you don't have a fruit tree at your house, it's kind of like you're not really Latino. So that's another kind of like insider story that was shared with me as an outsider. In many cases, people talked about nature as a place to meet God. And people talked about connecting with nature through love and relationality, not victimhood. So again, people are aware of the climate crisis and the disproportionate suffering, but that's not the stories that they're telling. So dominant understandings of environmentalism tend to think about communities of color through their focus on disproportionate suffering. La Tierra environmentalism balances case of victimhood with a focus on positive experiences that minority communities have with the natural world. All right, point number 2. A second aspect is that La Tierra environmentalism recognizes a sense of relationality with nature and sees nature as an aspect of everyday life. All right, so here's some pretty pictures for you to look at while I drink some water. Dominant discourses in modern environmentalism are focused on saving an endangered planet Earth from human harm. So there's the Earth on fire, right? It's like, crisis, we need to act, right? Emergency, alert. Modern environmentalism is rooted in these stories of connecting to the land through leisure and recreation, like camping and visiting national parks. And of course, we now know that the pristine, unpeopled landscapes that we love to go visit in wilderness areas and national parks are made possible by the forces of settler colonialism and the forced removal of indigenous people and other communities who'd been living in sustainable relationships with the land for centuries. So these are kind of like the discourses that dominant environmentalism has inherited. In dominant notions of environmentalism, nature is out there. It's a place we go on vacation, and it's separate from the spaces of everyday life. By contrast, La Tierra environmental narratives often center on humans' intimate relationships with the land as a part of everyday life. This slide is like a stock image. It did not come from my research. I felt kind of like I didn't really take pictures. I was enough of an outsider to begin with, and then going in and be like, can I take your pictures? I really didn't take many pictures at all, but I'm about to tell a story of somebody and her backyard chickens. So here's a story of, a picture of somebody with her backyard chickens. So La Tierra environmental narratives center on humans' intimate relationships with the land as part of everyday life. So again, that comment about loving a plant like a brother. Mariana was an educator in her early 50s who I met. She had immigrated to the United States from Lima, Peru as a young adult. She was telling me she had loved nature since her boyfriend introduced her to camping and hiking many years earlier. She said she rarely went camping or hiking anymore, but she still loved spending time outdoors. As she explained it, I have a nice big backyard, and I like to plant seeds and grow things. And I have 5 chickens in my yard. I like to be with them and hold them and talk to them. I have a lot of birds that come to my yard because there's chicken food everywhere. Mariana said that every morning when she woke up, she looked at the tree right outside her window. I hear the birds, and I just thank God for allowing me to hear this music from these birds. Then I go outside, and I try to make a very conscious effort to recognize that these things are gifts from God. So in my field, religion and environment, there's a really common word that people use to explain why the environment is a religious issue. Any guesses? Religious studies students? It's stewardship. Has anybody ever heard of stewardship? Stewardship is this notion that humans are called to care for the earth because it's a gift from God. So this is a screenshot of the kind of creation environmentalism page of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. It's just like the the structure that oversees all of Catholics in LA. So this is how they're talking about the environment or creation. God made this earth not for its own sake, but to be a home for the human family. The good things of creation are meant to be shared, developed, and used for the good of all of his children. And you'll note here, like, the earth is this tiny little thing in a human hand, right? The humans are going to take care of the earth. We're going to protect it, right? This tiny little vulnerable being. In my research, some Latinx Catholics offered a version of the stewardship argument when they told me why it was important to take care of the earth. But there was a second explanation that also emerged across sites. It's important to protect the environment because of the biblical mandate to love your neighbor as yourself. That's not in any of the religion and ecology books. So in contrast to the stewardship explanation that places humans as separate from and above nature, This relational viewpoint conceives of humans and the rest of nature as part of the same reality. The love your neighbor explanation is Christian because it directly references the Bible. But its assumption that neighbor involves the more than human world reflects an indigenous relational worldview. For many of my interlocutors, the line between humans and the rest of nature was blurred, and people referred to elements of nature as kin. So this is a quote that I already shared with you from Roger. God created everything, and we have to love all of creation. We love a plant like a brother. Neglecting nature is like seeing a brother in the street and not helping him. Cutting a tree is like scorning a brother. And so during that focus group where he said that, the next person built on Roger's comments. One man said that he described nature as a neighbor when he suggested that caring for nature is a fundamental aspect of faith because everything is interconnected. He said, to love God is to love your neighbor because God created everything. If we want to be loving to God, we must be concerned with all aspects of life. So by describing nature and trees as part of society, as a brother, and as a neighbor, these comments combine a Catholic commitment to the value of human life with an indigenous relational worldview that blurs the distinctions between humans and the rest of the world. La Tierra environmental narratives also focus heavily on recognition of humans' dependence on the land. So lots of stories that people told me of their parents growing up on farms and ranches in Mexico, and so they knew that if the rain didn't come on time, they wouldn't have enough to eat. And so those stories would get transmitted to the second generation young adults growing up in the United States with a recognition that food doesn't just magically appear at the grocery store for everybody, and that not everybody can just like turn on the hose and get water. So even for young people who grew up in the United States and did get food from the grocery store and water from the hose, these stories were told, and they recognize this sense of dependence. In La Tierra environmentalism, nature is the stuff that surrounds everyday life. The air we breathe, the birds nesting in the trees in the front yard, the mountains outside the window in Latin America. La Tierra environmentalism is about cherishing the relationships with nature in everyday life, much more than or in addition to protecting faraway landscapes from human incursion. There's a sense that nature is the place to meet God. All right, if you're keeping track, we're on number 3 of 3. All right. Oh man, sorry, that got cut off a little. The third aspect of La Tierra environmentalism is that it's transmitted primarily in the private spaces of the home. RS304, this one's for you. Most often through the example of pious, admired women. Even when people are aware of church teachings on environmental issues, they cite family members as the source of their environmental values. So Esmeralda was a retired school teacher who I met. She was involved with the Laudato Si ministry at her church. And she's somebody that had a second career as a volunteer after she retired from being a school teacher. She was mostly focused on incarceration and homelessness. But I met her through this Laudato Si group. And when I asked her about Laudato Si, which she'd read in its entirety with her, so it's a book basically. Laudato Si is essentially a little book. So she'd read it with this community at her church. She knew all about it. They discussed it at length. So she could tell me about Laudato Si with enthusiasm, talking about transitioning to solar energy and making small lifestyle changes like recycling more. But aside from answering my direct questions about Laudato Si, she talked about environmental values that she had learned from her grandma, an immigrant from Chihuahua, Mexico, who had raised her. She said that when she was growing up in El Paso, Texas, they were really poor, and her grandma made everything from scratch. She prepared food in the family kitchen, and she didn't waste anything. They made their own clothes. They would hang their clothes on the line to dry. Esmeralda emphasized her childhood included struggles, but they were happy. Even though they were poor, thanks to her grandma's hard labor, she said, we ate pretty good. Rice and beans, fresh tortillas, who could go wrong? When I asked her if it was related to her religion, she said yes, because my grandma was very, very into her Catholicism. Esmeralda learned her environmental values from her resilient working-class grandmother, a pious Catholic who prayed all the time. That's what Esmeralda said. Yeah, she just prayed all the time. She was very pious. Her grandma was the exemplar of Catholic piety, and since her grandma also embraced conservationist measures, Esmeralda associated conservation with her Catholic faith as well. So retaining practices such as sewing her own clothing, turning off the lights, not wasting food, these were things that Esmeralda was no longer doing those out of economic necessity, right? She could afford to leave the lights on. But she did these things as a way of connecting with her grandmother's memory as a way of embodying a strong connection with God, and simply because it's the right thing to do. So one more story about kind of being transmitted in the private spaces of the home. So I'm going to tell you about Rebecca and Elena, two sisters in their late 20s who are actively involved with their local church and a leadership program for young adults throughout the LA Archdiocese. They told me that taking care of the environment was an important part of the social justice tradition of the Catholic Church, and they were knowledgeable about global environmental issues such as climate change, the Pacific garbage patch, all kinds of stuff that's happening. They were really familiar with Pope Francis's teachings on Laudato Si, but they said the encyclical didn't really teach them anything new because it was consistent with the lessons that their mom had taught them throughout their childhood. So they were in a family of 6. There are 4 kids. Their dad supported the family as a garbage collector, and they were very, very aware of their financial precarity growing up. They said, we knew the value of a dollar. Their mom would tell them how many hours their dad worked in order to purchase any given item. As children, their family recycled and conserved because they knew the environment was in trouble. And their mom would point out the struggles of workers. So like, see that guy selling oranges on the side of the road? Look how hard he's working. He's standing out there for hours and hours, and he's probably not making very much money. Both of the sisters associated these stories and these lessons with this expansive view of environmentalism. And when I asked them, are these values related to your religion? They said, yeah. They didn't tell me it was because of the Bible. They didn't tell me it was because of Laudato Si. They said it was because of their mom. Being Catholic, this is Elena. Being Catholic, my mom always brought me up not to be wasteful. And it was always hand in hand with church teachings, like social justice. You shouldn't be wasteful. You should take what you need, and if you can, give to others. They learned to be environmentalists through their mother's daily prayers. Before each meal, their mother would offer a lengthy prayer asking God to bless everyone who contributed to the meal that they were about to eat, such as the campesinos who had harvested the vegetables, the truck drivers that brought the vegetables to the grocery store, the guys that stocked the shelves. They said prayers over Thanksgiving meals were especially detailed, sometimes lasting more than 10 minutes, because their mother had to bless everybody. You think about everything that went behind that platter of vegetables in front of you, even the truck driver. So these kinds of stories of home-based conservationist measures were widespread throughout my research. They were often connected to poverty, yes, but they were also connected to resilient, pious women and heritage traditions and respect for family and God. In these stories, it's important to turn off the lights to save money and because it's the right thing to do. All right, so this is the in conclusion part. In conclusion, Latiata environmentalism represents one of many overlooked theories of the environment where living in respectful relationship with Earth is not a matter of environmentalism. Instead, it's a routine aspect of everyday life and a matter of common sense. Acknowledging the legitimacy of Latiata environmentalism requires white scholars and environmentalists to recognize the limitations of our own paradigms and allow our intellectual frameworks to be challenged. While it may be tempting to dismiss sustainable practices of working-class immigrant communities as merely the result of their limited financial means, which I'm telling you, this is what, like when I brought this stuff to conferences early on, people were like, well, if they're taking the bus because they can't afford a car, then how is that environmentalism? That's a pretty widespread idea. Dismissing, refusing to accept these practices as environmental denies the strength of these communities' moral frameworks and perpetuates white supremacist ideologies and our definitions of environmentalism. All right, that's my scholarly argument for all the scholars in the room. But in the conclusion for my book, I make a few recommendations to scholars, policymakers, and environmental activists, but I'm gonna end now with the final paragraphs of the book, which I wrote for you. For my students at California State University Northridge, and the other emerging leaders who are bringing their communities diverse forms of knowledge and experience to our higher education classrooms, I've written this book to say, we need you. Many first-generation college students draw from multiple forms of wisdom as a matter of daily life. While they have learned to navigate the secular world of the modern university, they also remain intimately tied to the resilient, land-based communities of their ancestors, who knew what it meant to rely on the earth and who cultivated relationships of gratitude, mutuality, and respect. In my own classrooms, students have told me about plant-loving tias who talked to their flowers as if they were their own children. Subsistence farming grandfathers who did not have enough to eat when the rain did not come on time. and the backbreaking labor of parents, aunts, and uncles who toiled as migrant farm workers in the fields of Central California. Over and over again, students have written about childhood lessons where they have learned that you must take care of the earth because the earth takes care of you. I've written this book to convey that your voices, perspectives, and experiences matter. The models that global leaders have developed and the solutions they have proposed have not risen to the challenges that we face, and the situation with the climate is only getting worse. Please draw from the multiple forms of wisdom and moral frameworks that you value as you develop creative models for a better world, and demand that your perspectives are heard. We can't solve these problems without you. And that's it. And on that note, the Institute for Sustainability is doing a survey and wants to hear about you and your knowledge and your values, and that's what this QR code is for. So please do, all the students in the CSUN community in the room, take a picture of that and, fill it out when you're able.